The first time I noticed her, I wasn't looking for anything. She stepped out of the house next door like the world had paused, just for her. Not loud, not flashy, just deliberate. Every movement intentional. Every detail considered. Her posture spoke before she did. The way she carried herself wasn't performance, it was presence. Pure, undeniable presence that seemed to bend reality around her. And without knowing it, she planted something inside me that would take years to name. I remember standing there, frozen, watching her walk to her car. The morning light caught the fabric of her dress, creating shadows and highlights that moved with her body like poetry in motion. And for reasons I couldn't explain then, reasons I wouldn't dare speak out loud, something shifted inside me. Not attraction in the way I'd felt before. This was different, deeper, more personal, more intense. It felt like recognition, like seeing something I'd been searching for without knowing I was searching at all. Like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing until it appeared right in front of you. My coffee went cold in my hand. My heart started beating faster. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. And I knew, even then, that this moment would matter. I just didn't know how much. What I didn't know then was that this quiet admiration would soon stop being harmless. That 30 seconds of watching a stranger walk to her car would unravel years of carefully constructed denial. That the life I'd built, the identity I'd worn like armor, was about to crack wide open. My name is George. I'm 26 years old, and 3 months ago I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. It wasn't much. 800 square feet of possibility. Beige walls that had seen better days. Wooden floors that creaked in all the wrong places. A kitchen barely big enough for one person. A bathroom with tiles from the 90s. But it was mine. After years of sharing spaces with roommates who never washed dishes, who played music too loud, who existed in ways that made me feel like I was always apologizing for breathing, I finally had a place where I could connect to my inner self. Where I could think without judgment, where I could figure out who I was becoming without an audience analyzing every decision. The apartment was bare when I got the keys, completely empty. Just white walls and possibility, and the faint smell of paint from whatever cosmetic work the landlord had done to make it rentable. I stood in the middle of the living room that first day, my footsteps echoing, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the loud, optimistic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers maybe you can start over. Maybe you can become someone different here. Maybe you can finally figure out what's been bothering you all these years. I spent the first few weeks planning obsessively. Measuring every wall, every window, every corner. I ordered furniture online at 2 in the morning, scrolling through endless options, trying to imagine what kind of person I wanted to be in this space. What kind of life I wanted to build. Minimalist, cozy, professional, artistic? Who was George supposed to be? I didn't have an answer, so I bought generic furniture. Safe choices. A gray couch. A wooden coffee table. A bed frame that looked like every other bed frame. Curtains that matched nothing in particular. Everything designed to be invisible, unremarkable, safe, the same way I had designed myself. The moving company arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, early enough that the sky was still caught between night and dawn, that pale blue-gray that makes everything feel suspended in time. I stood outside with a coffee I had purchased from the gas station down the street, watching 2 men in matching company shirts unload my life from the back of a truck. Boxes labeled kitchen in my handwriting. Boxes labeled books that I hadn't opened in 2 years. A disassembled bed frame wrapped in protective blankets. A couch I'd bought secondhand that somehow felt like the most adult decision I'd ever made, even though the cushions were already sagging. My entire existence, reduced to maybe 20 boxes and some furniture. It should have felt depressing. But it felt like freedom. I wasn't paying attention to anything else. Not the neighbors. Not the street. Not the woman walking her dog 3 houses down, until I heard the door next to mine open. The sound was distinct. A door opening, yes, but also the subtle click of heels on concrete. A presence announcing itself before becoming visible. And then I saw her. Samantha. Though I didn't know her name yet, didn't know anything about her except what I could see in that moment. And what I saw stopped time. She stepped out wearing a fitted dark green bodycon midi dress that seemed to have been designed specifically for her body. Not just her measurements, her essence. The way she existed in space. It hugged her waist with mathematical precision, curved around her hips like it understood architecture, followed her thighs down to mid-calf, where it ended with perfect intentionality. The dress had a high neckline, modest, sophisticated, and long sleeves that should have made it conservative. But the lattice cutout design running along both arms transformed everything. Geometric patterns, crisscross designs that exposed skin in deliberate intervals. Not revealing, not provocative, just intentional. Like someone had calculated exactly how much exposure would create elegance instead of attention-seeking. The fabric was smooth, stretchy, matte. It moved with her body instead of against it. Every step created subtle shifts in how the dress caught light, how it emphasized or de-emphasized curves. This wasn't just clothing. This was architecture, design, purpose. Her hair was shoulder-length, straight, with a soft brown base that transitioned into lighter caramel highlights toward the ends. It was styled sleek, parted to one side, framing her face with the kind of precision that suggested she'd spent time in front of a mirror but wanted you to think she hadn't. Effortless effort. That's what it looked like. Her makeup was polished but natural. Defined brows that shaped her face. Subtle eye makeup, probably browns and taupes, though I was too far away to be sure. Warm contour that sculpted her cheekbones without looking like she was wearing a mask. Nude lips that didn't demand attention but somehow held it anyway. She wore nude, open-toe, ankle-strap high-heel sandals. Slim heels, probably 3 inches. The kind that add height and elongate legs and make every step look purposeful. Everything about her was composed, deliberate, confident without being aggressive. She existed in her body the way most people can only dream of existing in theirs. And I couldn't look away. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was dressed well, though she was. But because seeing her felt like looking at something I'd been missing my entire life without knowing what I was missing. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Forgot the movers carrying my couch past me. Forgot the coffee cup in my hand growing cold. Forgot my name, forgot what year it was. It was as if a part of me I'd buried a long time ago had suddenly been unearthed by a stranger who had no idea what she was doing to me. Not by choice, not by plan, not by anything I could control, just by proximity, by existing. She walked toward me, not quickly, not slowly, just purposefully, each step measured, each movement economical, but graceful. I tried to look casual, tried to pretend I hadn't been staring, failed completely. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, her voice warm but measured. Professional but friendly, the kind of voice that suggested she'd practiced conversations like this before. I nodded, managed something resembling a smile. My mouth was dry. My brain had stopped forming coherent sentences. "Yeah," I said, "just moving in today." "Brilliant, George." Truly inspired dialogue, she smiled back. Polite, kind, the kind of smile that said she'd already categorized me as harmless neighbor and filed me away mentally. "Welcome to the building," she said. "I'm in 4B. If you need anything, let me know." "Thanks," I said. "I'm George. 4A." She nodded, offered one more polite smile, then excused herself and walked to her car, a newer model sedan, black, pristine, and drove away. That was it. Maybe 45 seconds total? Less than a minute of interaction that I've replayed 10,000 times since. But those 45 seconds changed everything. Because in that brief moment, something inside me woke up. Something I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. A feminine energy I'd ignored, denied, suppressed, buried beneath layers of what I thought I was supposed to be. What men are supposed to be. What masculinity is supposed to look like. I'd built walls around that part of myself. Tall walls. Thick walls. Walls reinforced by years of social conditioning and fear and shame and the desperate need to be normal. And in 45 seconds, watching a stranger in a green dress walk to her car, those walls cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked. And standing there, alone with moving men in boxes and a cold coffee, watching her taillights disappear down the street, I realized something that terrified me more than anything I'd ever felt. I couldn't bury it anymore. I didn't want to. After that morning, I started noticing her. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Just natural observation of a neighbor. The kind of casual awareness you develop when you live next to someone. But I was lying to myself. Because coincidence doesn't have you memorizing schedules. Coincidence doesn't have you positioning yourself near windows at specific times. Coincidence doesn't have your heart rate accelerating when you hear a door open. This was observation. Deliberate, shameful, obsessive observation. I'd see her leaving for work most mornings around 8:15. Always put together, always composed. Never rushed, even when logically she must have been running late. Some days she wore dresses. Some days tailored pants with blouses that somehow looked both professional and elegant. Some days, blazers that fit like they'd been custom made. But it wasn't just the clothes. It was the way she inhabited them. She never slouched. Not once. Not even when carrying grocery bags or talking on her phone or fumbling with her keys. Her posture was constant, shoulders back, spine straight, head held at an angle that suggested confidence without arrogance. She never fidgeted, never picked at her nails or played with her hair or did any of the small, unconscious movements most people do without thinking. Every gesture seemed considered. Every choice of fabric, every accessory, every stride, it all felt purposeful, deliberate, like she'd decided who she was and refused to compromise. I'd watch from my window, not directly, I told myself, just peripherally, just happening to be near the window when she left, just coincidentally making coffee at 8:10 every morning, and I started wondering what that felt like. Not to be her. That wasn't it, that's what I kept telling myself anyway. But to feel what she felt. To carry myself with that kind of presence, that kind of confidence. To exist in my body the way she existed in hers. To walk through the world like I belonged there instead of apologizing for taking up space. I told myself it was nothing, just appreciation. The way you might admire a painting or a well-designed building or a perfectly executed dance move. But deep down, in places I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew better. Because appreciation doesn't keep you up at night. Appreciation doesn't make your chest tighten when you see someone walk by. Appreciation doesn't make you replay 45 seconds of interaction in your mind until it becomes something bigger than it was. Until it becomes mythology. Until it becomes the most significant thing that happened to you all year. This was something else. Something I didn't have language for. Longing, maybe? Belonging for what? I started noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. Not just about her. About femininity in general. The way certain fabrics moved, silk versus cotton versus synthetic blends. How they caught light differently. How they suggested different levels of formality, different intentions. The structure of a well-fitted dress. How darts and seams and tailoring could transform fabric into architecture. How clothing could shape a body instead of just covering it. The subtle power of the right posture. How standing differently could change how people perceived you. How presence was as much about body language as appearance. I found myself watching women differently, not objectifying them, or at least not in the traditional sense, but studying them. Trying to decode what made elegance feel like elegance instead of costume. What separated intentionality from performance? I watched how they moved through spaces, how they handled themselves in conversations, how they occupied silence differently than men did. And slowly, quietly, like a thought forming in the back of your mind that you can't quite articulate yet, something began growing. A dangerous thought. An impossible thought. What if I tried? Not publicly. God, no. Not visibly. Just privately, in the safety of my own space, where no one would know, where no one would judge. What if I gave myself permission to explore this feeling that had been growing louder every day since that Thursday morning? I resisted at first, told myself it was ridiculous, that I was overthinking a passing curiosity, that this was just some weird fascination that would fade if I ignored it long enough. I threw myself into work, into setting up the apartment, into anything that would distract me from the thought that kept circling back. But the thought didn't leave. It grew. Every time I saw her, it grew. Every time I noticed how someone carried themselves with grace, it grew. Every time I caught myself in the mirror and felt disappointed by what I saw, it grew. Until finally, one night, 3 weeks after moving in, alone in my apartment with the lights off and the world quiet, I stopped resisting. I opened my closet and stared at my clothes. Button-downs in various shades of blue and white. Jeans. Khakis. T-shirts with logos from places I'd been or bands I'd seen. Jackets that were functional but boring. Shoes designed for comfort, not style. All of it safe. All of it acceptable. All of it designed to help me disappear into the background of masculinity without drawing attention or questions. And all of it felt wrong. Not uncomfortable, just incomplete, like I was wearing a costume of who I was supposed to be instead of clothes that reflected who I was. And then I remembered something. Years ago, 4 years, maybe 5, on a whim I never fully understood, I'd bought a pair of heels. I was in a thrift store, killing time, browsing racks of things I'd never wear. And I saw them, simple black heels. Modest height, maybe 2.5 inches. Closed toe, nothing fancy. I picked them up, pretending I was looking for a gift. Checked the size. They were close to mine. Maybe a little small, but close. And before I could talk myself out of it, I bought them. $5. Cash. No explanation needed. I told myself it was a joke, a stupid impulse buy that I'd laugh about later. I took them home, stuffed them in the back of my closet behind winter coats I never wore, and forgot about them. Or at least, I pretended to forget. But I hadn't forgotten. Not really. I pulled them out that night. 3 weeks into my new life in my new apartment. Black. Simple. Still in decent condition, despite years of hiding. I stared at them for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. My brain was screaming at me to put them back, to stop this before it started, to maintain the walls I'd worked so hard to build. But my body wasn't listening, and before I could talk myself out of it, I slipped them on. The feeling was immediate and overwhelming. My posture changed first. Automatically, my weight shifted forward onto the balls of my feet. My back straightened, my hips tilted slightly. My center of gravity transformed. I looked down at my legs, the same legs I'd had my entire life, and they looked different, longer, leaner. The muscle definition changed. The proportion of calf to thigh altered. It was unfamiliar, but not wrong. It was grounding, like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. I stood there in my bedroom, in my regular clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, wearing heels I'd bought years ago and never touched, and I felt more like myself than I had in years. I took a step, then another, wobbling slightly, unsteady, learning how to balance on a heel instead of a flat sole. It was harder than it looked. Walking in heels wasn't just about standing taller. It was about changing how your entire body moved, how your hips swayed, how your feet pointed, how each step required more intention than regular walking. I walked around my apartment, slowly at first, then with more confidence as muscle memory I didn't know I had began kicking in. And standing there, alone, in a pair of heels I'd bought 5 years ago and hidden away like contraband, I realized something that terrified me more than anything I'd ever admitted. I didn't want to stop. This feeling, this alignment, this rightness, this sense of pieces fitting together, I didn't want it to end. I wanted more. But wanting more meant admitting something I'd spent 26 years denying. And I wasn't ready for that yet. So I took off the heels, put them back in the closet, tried to pretend it hadn't happened, tried to convince myself it was just curiosity, just experimentation, just a weird phase that would pass. But lying in bed that night, I knew the truth. This wasn't passing. This was just beginning. The turning point came 2 weeks later on a Saturday afternoon that should have been unremarkable. I needed curtains for the apartment. The windows in the bedroom faced east, and every morning the sunlight came in like an interrogation lamp. Bright, harsh, unforgiving, waking me up at 6:30 whether I wanted to be awake or not. So I drove to a home supply store across town, planning to grab something functional, blackout curtains, maybe beige or gray, and leave. Simple, easy, unmemorable. But nothing about that day ended up being simple. I found the curtains quickly enough. 2 panels. Beige. Boring. Exactly what I needed. But on the way to checkout, I made a mistake. I took a wrong turn. Ended up in the clothing section, a small corner of the store that sold basic items. Work shirts, cheap jeans, clearance racks of things nobody wanted. I should have turned around immediately, but I didn't, because that's when I saw it. The dress. It was on a clearance rack, tucked between a dozen other pieces that had been marked down to almost nothing. A white bodycon dress with a luxury chain print pattern in gold, brown, and black tones. Interlocking chains, Baroque-style details, long sleeves. Mini length. It was exactly the kind of dress I'd imagined, the kind I'd seen in photos online during late-night scrolling sessions I told myself didn't mean anything. The kind of dress that suggested elegance, intentionality, purpose. I stopped walking. My heart started pounding. My mouth went dry. My hands were suddenly sweating. I looked around, paranoid, checking if anyone was watching me. If anyone would notice a man in his 20s staring at a women's dress like it held the answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. The section was empty. Just me and racks of clearance clothing nobody wanted. I reached out and touched the fabric. Smooth, stretchy. That same matte quality I'd noticed in her green dress. The quality that suggested the dress would move with a body instead of against it. I checked the price tag. $15. Marked down from $60. I stood there for 10 minutes. Maybe longer. Having an entire argument with myself in complete silence. This is ridiculous. You don't need this. You can't buy this. What if someone sees you? What would you even do with it? This is wrong. This is weird. This is shameful. But underneath the shame was something louder. Want. Pure, undeniable want. I kept pretending to look at other things. Picked up a work shirt, put it back. Examined a pair of jeans I'd never wear. Wandered to a different aisle, but I kept coming back to the dress. Every time I walked away, something pulled me back. And finally, I stopped fighting. I grabbed the dress, held it casually like I was shopping for a girlfriend or a sister, like this was completely normal, like my hands weren't shaking. And I walked to the checkout. Paid in cash. Avoided eye contact with the teenage cashier who didn't care what I was buying anyway. Folded it into a plain plastic bag and walked out like I was smuggling contraband across an international border. My car was parked in the back of the lot. I sat there for 20 minutes, bag in my lap, staring at nothing. What had I just done? Buying the heels years ago had been impulsive. A moment of curiosity I could dismiss as a joke. But this was different. This was deliberate. Intentional. A choice I couldn't undo. Buying this dress meant admitting something I'd spent my entire life denying. And I knew, sitting there in that parking lot with a $15 dress in my lap, that I wasn't done. Because if I was gonna do this, if I was gonna give this feeling room to breathe, I needed to do it properly. Half measures wouldn't work. Pretending wouldn't work. I needed everything. I drove to a beauty supply store on the other side of town, somewhere no one from my neighborhood would ever go, somewhere I could disappear into anonymity. The store was overwhelming. Rows and rows of products I didn't understand, foundations in 100 different shades, contour palettes, highlighters, eyeshadow sets with names like sultry and smoky and natural glam. I walked the aisle slowly, pretending to know what I was looking for. I grabbed foundation after testing several shades on my wrist, trying to find something close to my skin tone. A contour kit that claimed to be beginner-friendly, blush in a soft peach tone, an eyeshadow palette with neutral browns and taupes, mascara, eyeliner, lipstick in a nude shade, brushes. So many brushes, I had no idea what half of them were for, but I grabbed a set that claimed to have everything you need. Then the wig. I spent 30 minutes staring at options. Long, short, curly, straight, every color imaginable. Finally, I chose one. Long, wavy, blonde. Beach waves with darker roots for a natural gradient. The kind I'd seen in transformation videos on YouTube during 3 a.m. research sessions I'd never admit to anyone. And then the items I'd been avoiding: hip pads, breast forms, butt pads. The things that would transform me from a man playing dress-up into something that actually resembled the image in my head. I grabbed them quickly, not letting myself think too hard. Not letting shame stop me. By the time I reached the checkout, my cart was full and my credit card was about to take a serious hit. $347. The cashier, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and zero judgment, scanned everything without comment. "Someone's doing a transformation," she said casually, smiling. I froze, felt my face burning. "My sister, I managed. Halloween costume." She nodded. Didn't believe me, didn't care. "Tell her to use primer before foundation," she said. "Makes a huge difference." I nodded, paid. Left before my voice could betray me any further. By the time I got home, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across my apartment. I locked the door, drew all the curtains, double-checked that the door was locked again. And then I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by bags and boxes, feeling like I'd just crossed a line I could never uncross. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine what this could actually feel like. Not as a fantasy, not as a distant dream, as a reality, as something I was about to do. I looked at everything spread out in front of me. The dress, the heels from years ago, the wig, the pads, the makeup, everything I needed to become someone I'd only ever imagined. And I realized something that should have terrified me, but somehow felt like relief. I wasn't going to stop. Not anymore. But before I could take that final step, before I could transform from George into whoever I was about to become, I needed to understand one thing. Was I ready for what this meant? Was I ready to see myself as I'd always wanted to be seen? The answer should have taken time. Should have required deep reflection and careful consideration. But I already knew. I'd known since that Thursday morning 3 months ago, since I saw her step out in that green dress and felt something inside me recognize itself. I was ready. I didn't rush. That was important to me, critical even. This wasn't about desperation. This wasn't about shame or secrecy or doing something wrong in the dark. This was intentional. This was me, finally giving myself permission to become. I laid everything out on my bed methodically. The dress, the heels, the wig, the pads, the makeup, organized by order of application. And I started with the foundation. Literally and figuratively, I'd watch tutorials, hours of them, sitting in my apartment at 2 in the morning with headphones on, volume low, watching drag queens and trans women and makeup artists explain the basics. Primer, foundation, contour, highlight, blush, eyes, lips. I knew the theory. But theory and practice are completely different universes. I washed my face first, twice, patted it dry with a clean towel. Then, primer. A thin layer, smoothed across my skin, filling in pores and creating a smooth canvas. It felt strange, foreign, but not unpleasant. Then, foundation. My hands were shaking as I squeezed the first drop onto the back of my hand. The color looked close under the bathroom light. Close enough, anyway. I applied it with a damp beauty sponge, the way the tutorials had shown. Dabbing, not rubbing. Building coverage gradually instead of slapping it on all at once. Watching my face change in the mirror was surreal. The foundation evened out my skin tone, made my complexion smoother, more uniform. The slight redness around my nose disappeared. The shadow of stubble I could never fully eliminate softened. I looked like me, but also not like me. Like a version of me that had been smoothed out, refined, prepared for something more. Contour came next. This was the part one was most nervous about. Contour could make or break a face. Too much looked like mud. Too little did nothing. I followed the lines I'd memorized from countless videos. Under my cheekbones, creating the illusion of shadow and depth. Along my jawline, trying to soften the masculine angles. Down the sides of my nose, making it appear more delicate. I blended obsessively. More than I probably needed to. But I was terrified of looking like a clown. Slowly, my face began to change. Not dramatically, not like magic, but subtly. The harsh angles softened. My cheekbones looked higher. My jaw looked less square. Highlight came next. On top of my cheekbones. Down the bridge of my nose. In the inner corners of my eyes. On my Cupid's bow. It caught the light, created dimension, made my face look less flat. Blush. A soft peach tone swept across the apples of my cheeks. Color. Life. Warmth. I stared at myself. The person looking back was starting to look feminine. Not perfectly. Not flawlessly. But noticeably. Eyes came next. Eyeshadow. I kept it simple. Neutral browns from the palette I'd bought. A light shade across the lid. A medium shade in the crease. A dark shade in the outer corner. Blend. 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 The tutorials had been emphatic about blending. Then eyeliner. A thin line along my upper lash line. Nothing dramatic, just definition. And mascara. I'd never realized how heavy mascara felt. 3 coats, the way the instructions said. My lashes felt thick, foreign, like I was wearing something too big for my face. But when I looked in the mirror, my eyes looked bigger, more open, more expressive. Finally, lips. A nude shade with a slight gloss. Nothing bold. Nothing that would draw too much attention. I pressed my lips together, checked for smudges, and then I stepped back and looked at myself completely. The face staring back at me wasn't George. Not entirely. It was someone in between. Someone who existed in the space between masculine and feminine. Someone who was starting to look like the person I'd imagined. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I went to my bedroom and began the next phase. The breast forms first. I'd bought B cups. Nothing excessive. Just enough to create a natural-looking shape. I positioned them carefully in the pockets of the special bra I'd bought with them. Adjusted them until they sat evenly, until they looked proportional to my frame. When I looked down, I saw curves where there had never been curves before. It was disorienting and affirming at the same time. Hip pads next. These were more complicated. They attached with elastic straps that wrapped around my waist and thighs, holding foam pads that would create the illusion of wider hips. I adjusted them multiple times, trying to get them positioned correctly. Too high looked wrong. Too low looked wrong. Finally, I got them right. My silhouette changed. My waist looked smaller in comparison to my hips. My body had curves now. The beginning of an hourglass shape. The butt pads were last. Similar concept. Foam padding that created shape and volume where I naturally had none. I put on special shapewear over everything. Compression garments designed to smooth out lines and hold everything in place. And then I looked at myself in the mirror. My body had transformed. Not perfectly, not like a biological woman's body, but enough. Enough that with the right clothing, I could pass. Enough that the silhouette read as feminine instead of masculine. I stood there for a long time, just staring. This was really happening. I picked up the dress. The white bodycon with the luxury chain print. The one that had started this entire day. I slid it over my head carefully, pulling it down over the pads, over my transformed body. The fabric was tight, body-hugging in exactly the way I'd imagined. It emphasized every curve the pads had created, made my waist look tiny, made my hips look round and full. The long sleeves covered my arms. The hem ended mid-thigh. I adjusted it, smoothed out wrinkles, pulled it down slightly. And then I looked in the mirror. Oh my God. The person staring back at me was beautiful. Not in an objective way. Maybe other people wouldn't think so. Maybe I was biased. But to me, in that moment, she was perfect. The wig came next. Long, wavy blonde hair. I positioned it carefully on my head, adjusting the front to cover my hairline. Tucked away any stray bits of my natural hair. Positioned it until it looked natural. The transformation was complete. I had long blonde hair cascading down my back. Beach waves with darker roots. It framed my face, softened all the remaining masculine angles. And finally, the heels. The nude, open-toe ankle-strap sandals with slim heels I had bought with the dress in mind. I stepped into them, buckled the straps around my ankles, and I stood up. My center of gravity shifted dramatically. With the combination of heels and padding, my posture straightened automatically. My back arched slightly. My legs looked impossibly long and lean. I took a step toward the full-length mirror in my bedroom. Then another step. My hips swayed. The dress moved with my body. The heels clicked softly against the wooden floor. And then I saw myself completely, the entire transformation. And I stopped breathing. The woman looking back at me from the mirror wasn't George. She was someone else entirely. Someone with curves and elegance and presence. Someone whose makeup was applied with care. Whose dress hugged her body in all the right places. Whose hair framed her face with softness and femininity. Someone who looked confident, poised, intentional. Someone I'd been hiding for 26 years. I turned slowly, examining every angle. The way the dress emphasized my curves, the way my legs looked in the heels, the way my hair moved when I turned my head, the way my hands looked more delicate now, more graceful, the way everything came together into something I'd only ever imagined. Tears started forming in my eyes, but I couldn't let myself cry. Not now. Not after spending an hour on makeup. So I just stood there, staring at myself, feeling something I'd never felt before. Not pride exactly, not excitement, something deeper. Wholeness, like pieces of myself I'd been keeping separate had finally been allowed to exist in the same space. Like I'd finally given myself permission to be complete. I practiced walking back and forth across my bedroom, learning how to move in the heels, in the dress, in this body that felt both foreign and familiar. How to take smaller steps, how to let my hips sway naturally, how to hold my shoulders back and my head high, how to move with intention instead of just moving. I practiced sitting, how to lower myself carefully, how to cross my legs at the ankle, how to arrange the dress so it didn't ride up too high. All these small things I'd never had to think about before. All these details that made femininity feel deliberate instead of accidental. I took photos. Not to share with anyone. Not to post anywhere. Just to remember. To prove to myself that this was real. That I'd done this. That I'd given myself permission to become. I must have taken 50 photos from different angles. In different poses. With different expressions. Each one felt like documentation of something impossible becoming possible. And standing there, alone in my apartment, transformed into someone I'd only ever dreamed of being, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Deep, genuine peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment. Everything inside me that had been fighting finally stopped fighting. Everything that had been buried finally had permission to surface. Everything that had been denied finally existed. This wasn't a costume. This wasn't drag. This wasn't performance. This was language. A way of expressing something I'd never had words for. A way of existing I'd never been taught but somehow already knew. I stood in front of the mirror for what felt like hours. Maybe it was hours. Time had stopped meaning anything, and I understood, finally, what I'd been searching for all these years. Not to be someone else. Not to escape myself. But to become more fully myself, to give permission to the parts of me that had been silenced, to honor the femininity that had always existed, waiting for acknowledgement. I didn't need to be her. my neighbor Samantha, the woman who'd planted this seed. I needed to be me, the version of me that included femininity. That included elegance. That included intentionality and presence and all the things I'd been taught men weren't supposed to embody. But stepping into this truth came with questions I couldn't avoid anymore. What happens next? What happens when transformation stops being private and starts feeling like a secret? What happens when you've finally seen yourself clearly and you can't unsee it? What happens when you know you can never go back to pretending? I didn't have answers yet, but standing there, looking at her, at me, in the mirror, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The days that followed were different. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone else would notice, but internally, everything had shifted. I didn't stop. Didn't pack everything away and pretend it had been a one-time experiment. I transformed again. The next weekend. And the weekend after that. Each time, I learned something new. How to blend foundation more seamlessly. How to make my contour look less obvious in natural light. How to apply mascara without getting it all over my eyelids. How to walk in heels without looking like a baby giraffe learning to use its legs. How to sit. How to stand. How to move my hands in ways that felt graceful instead of performative. How to let femininity be deliberate instead of desperate. I bought more clothes. Nothing expensive. Nothing extravagant. A black dress. A blue one. Skirts in various lengths. Tops that actually fit the body I'd created with padding. Each piece taught me something about how clothing constructs femininity, how different cuts and fabrics and structures create different versions of feminine presentation. I never left the apartment dressed. That was a line I wasn't ready to cross. Maybe I'd never be ready. This wasn't about validation from others. This wasn't about passing in public or living full-time as a woman. This was about validation from myself. This was about giving space to a part of me that had been suffocated for 26 years. This was about permission. I'd still see Samantha in passing sometimes. In the hallway, in the parking lot, walking to her car in the mornings. She'd smile, wave, ask how I was settling in, make small talk about weather or packages or building maintenance, and I'd smile back, carrying on normal neighbor conversations, knowing she had absolutely no idea what she'd sparked in me, knowing that 3 feet away, through a single wall, I had a closet full of dresses and heels and makeup, knowing that the person talking to her in jeans and a button-down had spent the previous night in a blonde wig and a bodycon dress, learning how to be someone else entirely. But I didn't need her to know. I didn't need anyone to know. Because this was never about her. She was a catalyst. A mirror. A reflection of something I'd been too afraid to see in myself. Her elegance wasn't something I wanted to imitate. It wasn't a goal I was trying to reach. It was a reminder. A reminder that elegance, presence, intentionality, these weren't gendered traits. They weren't exclusively feminine or exclusively masculine. They were choices. Ways of moving through the world with purpose instead of apology. And I could choose them too. Even when I wasn't dressed, even when I was just George, going about my regular life, I started carrying myself differently. I stopped slouching, stopped hunching my shoulders, stopped trying to make myself smaller to take up less space. I started paying attention to how I moved. Not in a feminine way necessarily, just in an intentional way. I started making eye contact instead of looking at the ground. Started speaking more clearly instead of mumbling. Started existing in my body instead of trying to escape it. The femininity I'd discovered in private was teaching me something about presence in general, about being deliberate, about honoring yourself instead of hiding, about remembering that how you exist matters. I stopped calling it a fantasy, because fantasy implies something impossible, something that only exists in imagination. This was real. I was real. This version of me I'd been building, discovering, honoring, was real. And femininity wasn't something I was borrowing, wasn't drag, wasn't performance, wasn't costume. It was choice, discipline, presence. It was mine, as much mine as any other part of my identity. I didn't have all the answers yet. Didn't know what label fit, didn't know if I was trans or gender fluid or just a man who enjoyed feminine presentation. And I realized I didn't need to know yet. Labels could come later, understanding could come later. Right now, I just needed to exist. To give myself permission to be complex, to be multiple things, to contain contradictions, to be George and also be her, to be masculine and also be feminine, to be both, and neither and everything in between, could exist in both spaces without either being less real. Looking back now, 3 months into this journey, I realize how much of my life I spent running from myself From the parts that didn't fit the narrative I'd been handed at birth. From the femininity I'd been taught was wrong for someone with my body. I thought femininity was something external, something other people had that I could only admire from a distance, something I could appreciate but never embody. I thought it was about genetics, about being born a certain way, about having the right body or the right face or the right voice. But it was never about any of that. Femininity isn't biology. It's not chromosomes or hormones or reproductive systems. It's intentionality. It's moving through the world with purpose, with grace, with presence. It's making choices about how you want to exist and then having the courage to exist that way. And I could choose that too.
The Gender Diary exists to light that path with shared stories. Whether you found connection in this narrative, you're on your own journey of gender exploration, or you're here seeking understanding, your subscription fuels our mission. Every subscriber empowers us to keep illuminating these authentic experiences for our community. Kindly drop a comment below. Your voice adds to the tapestry of experiences that makes this space meaningful. Until our next story unfolds.